don't know what technology is this. VR stuff.
You have text on your glasses. Should this be there? Not on your glasses.
Ah, yeah. But these are not real glasses.
No.
You're just looking like...
Hello, hey.
Hey, Liridona.
Hey, welcome. Thank you.
Jag ska inte ha en solo. Jag sitter på
Yes.
Yes. We're very glad to find it. Yes.
I don't know if she's like Russian.
So nice of you. I like it. Very good.
So, welcome everyone to this amazingly beautiful winter morning in Stockholm. And welcome to Liridona PhD Defense at KTH, the Royal Institute of Technology. My name is Susanne Nilsson, and I will function as the chairperson today. I will explain what happens and present the committee and the opponent here. So, Liridona has been associated during her PhD program to the Unit of Integrated Product Development and Design at the Machine Design Department at the School of Industrial Engineering and Management. And today, her main advisories are here. Sofia Ritzén, Professor Sofia Ritzén is her main advisory. You can maybe wave. And then we have her assistant, supervisor Jenny, Dr. Jenny Jan-Hagersby. And Liridona, she will be defending her PhD thesis with the following title: Sharing the Design Authorship of Sustainability Towards Co-Creation of Sustainable Transport Systems and Practices. And we are delighted to have Professor Samsa Hysalo with us. He is the opponent today, and he's on the link here. You might see him here, and he's from the Aalto University in Finland. Warmly welcome. And we are also very happy to have about our evaluation committee. And we have the committee is present here below, and it consists of Professor Kasper Hooks at the Norwegian University of Science and Technology, Norway, and the senior lecturer Helena Strömberg at Chalmers University of Technology in Gothenburg, and then also adjunct professor Carolina Isaksson at KTH, the Royal Institute of Technology. Warmly welcome to all of you. The defense will proceed as follows. Firstly, Liridona will present her a summary of her thesis content for around 30 minutes. And following her presentation, there will be a discussion between her and her opponent. And there are no time limits when it comes to that discussion, but usually it takes a couple of hours. And following that discussion, we will have the evaluation committee to ask their questions to Liridona. And during the discussion between the opponent and Liridona, and during the questions from the committee, no one else is allowed to ask any questions or comment anything, neither here in the room or the cyberspace. But after the questions from the committee has been finalized or answered, then we will open up the floor for the public, and you will all be allowed to ask questions or comment. So that includes all of you in the audience. It also includes the evaluation committee, the supervisors, the opponent. And after then, this public part of the defense, this public defense will be closed, and then it's time for the evaluation committee to meet. And they will meet in closed doors. And during their discussion, you are all allowed to stay in the room to await their decision whether the thesis is approved or not. I think that was actually all about the procedure. So now we can open up the floor for Liridona. Welcome.
Thank you, Susanne. Wow. I didn't expect the room to be full, but it's so nice to see you all here. Thank you very much for all of you coming today. I really feel honored. Thank you to the committee for having managed to be physically here, and also to Professor Santavisole. Thank you for being here today. Thank you, family and friends, and all my colleagues. I really appreciate all of you. I'm really happy to be here and discuss what I think is an emerging, relevant and critical topic of our time. And I do so what I think is that it's going to become more growing in the future. Perhaps today is not very much practiced, but I think in the future it might be quite an important topic and relevant for the way our societies think and grow and prosper. So my thesis work attempts to build on the idea of sharing the design authorship, and I intentionally and provocatively named my thesis this way, because usually authorship means that you write books and then you include some of the authors. But in this case, when we're talking about sustainability, which is the primary focus of my thesis, we have come to see that not always everybody is included in the process. And the errors of the 20th century have brought us to the place where we are today, and I believe that the design of the future systems upon which our life will be dependent on need to be more inclusive, need to be more participatory, need to include more authors in the making of it. So that's kind of the basic philosophy behind this title. I'll give you a little bit of an overview of my thesis just to get to know what I've covered. What I managed to cover in this thesis is really just the tip of the iceberg, and I hope this will grow into future research avenues. But this thesis currently contains 9 chapters covering the topic of my main focus, and then it includes 3 research projects that have been reported in the thesis. It also reports 6 research publications appended, and also of which 4 are journal articles and 2 conference papers. 11 other publications that I've made have not been appended, but they contribute to my overall development in the last 6 years of my doctoral studies. So I began my thesis with one premise, mainly suggesting that involvement of people for whom new sustainable systems are designed must be involved in the process of design and development if we are going to reach the targets of sustainability. I think this is very important, especially for societies and industry aspiring to reduce carbon emissions, energy use, and overconsumption of material resources. The reasons why I think this is an important aspect is because of 4 main arguments that I raised, which are, one is the product life cycle. So today, the way we consume products and services has to do a lot, not just with the way we produce them, but also the way we use, and therefore people who are the end users in this process are really a relevant stakeholder, because they determine the total ecological impacts of these products and services. The other is that we have seen with time that some of the things, like innovative solutions, when we put into society and into everyday life context, sometimes they counteract the effects or backfire, meaning that we lose the energy efficiency that we planned in the production process, we lose that at the use phase. Sometimes people start to consume more because of the environmental positive effects that they perceive in new technologies. The other is that for many new sustainable systems, what we see is that there is behavioral adjustments and social practices that are required to change. Therefore, if people are more involved in these processes, I believe that it would be more meaningful to engage society towards this transition of the, in terms of implementation and so on. And the last one is that there are very much many uncertainties related to the total socio-ecological impacts of the new alternatives, and therefore this impedes sometimes the initiatives by several stakeholders to pursue innovative solutions and engage with sustainability issues. So overall, what this means that people can be more than just users and consumers of the services and products and systems that we design for them. So, but this is finally mostly the perceived, the known, or at least the industrial practice today is widely thinking that people who are using the services are mainly just using and consuming. But instead, I propose that people are actually active and competent participants in creating the modes of living. They are actually changing subjects with complex everyday lives, and therefore they must be involved in the process of our design. So if we found ourselves, put my feet somewhere in research, I've seen that research on users actually is a long, more than 5 decades of research on this, especially on the idea of end users or people for whom the technologies are usually intended, like new systems. What this research suggests is that users of any product and service and system technology actually do more than matter. So according to research, we see that there is a relevant aspect into including users in the process of design and development. Everyday people have historically also contributed a lot to the development of technologies. And I'll share a little bit more on the transportation sector, what that means. So overall, I start my thesis with the idea that if we are serious about climate change and the consequences of socio-ecological inequities, then the existing design and development models that we have will not continue to suffice us towards the goals we have for sustainability, especially not if few people are treated as designers of these systems and the rest as users or even more just consumers. So my thesis then proposes that what we could do is actually look into the idea of how we can co-creatively aspire towards new transportation systems and practices. I focus my empirical research in transport because this system is quite interesting and relevant. It's very complex and quite essential for society, and I'll share a little bit more on that later. So the overall aim of my thesis has been to see how multiple stakeholders, not just end users, but several other, like public and private organizations, could be involved in the co-creation of design and development of sustainable systems. What are the processes of doing so? How do these contribute? And what are the potential outcomes or impacts related towards supporting us into implementation of new sustainable systems? I base my basically the theoretical dispositions that I raise up in the thesis are founded on key areas of what we know as human-centric paradigms, which are stemming from research and interest of people's participation in design processes. These are basically coming from democratic design, participatory design, and inclusive design approaches. What these throughout the last, especially the last 3 decades, have tried to do is actively seek and engage people and multiple stakeholders in design and innovation. So co-creation stems from this, although it is quite an interdisciplinary concept applied in multiple disciplines, so it's very broad, and therefore I try to focus here more in the design and innovation studies. The main assumption that actually theoretically I take is that instead of seeing social practices or social systems and technological systems as separate, I try to break that link and say that they cannot be separated. That link is very artificial. We always are, by designing, also creating opportunities for social practices to emerge, create, or re-alter later. Therefore, it's very important to start from this assumption in the thesis, because actually this is the way I perceive the world. And more and more research actually supports that social systems and technological systems cannot be seen as separate. And these are mainly, today, new research is showing that they are intertwined actually with everyday life practices of people. So if we are designing, let's say, electric cars, we're also proposing new ways of moving, not just in terms of powertrains and technologies of the car. We are also allowing people to think differently about the way they move. So during the thesis, as I explore and build on the areas of design research and innovation research, I try to build on 3 main arguments where I looked at how the area of user involvement should suggest how people can contribute to design and development. And then I build on what are the methods for how people can be involved in these processes, and also starting to open the idea with how then people can be involved in more than just the user role, meaning that instead of just being users of new technologies, how can people actually be creative participants in shaping and designing that. So I come to this arriving understanding that actually co-creation means presence in design, meaning that people are actually being vocal and actively contributing to the shaping of the decision-making around the solutions. So co-creation, in my theoretical view, becomes an idea that it is an approach to both share the design, but also a process to drive collective change. Why I try to take this theoretical position is because of these main elements, which is trying to, what designers have tried to do, especially in the last decades, is to see how power relationships between designers and developers and users are being shaped, and how that affects the decision-making for alternatives, but also to look into the idea of agency and shared ownership over the alternatives in order to improve the social legitimacy of decision-making for new alternatives. I strictly do not believe that new sustainable systems should be developed by the few, but actually should be through the participation of many. So that is kind of the theoretical premise that I try to bring up in my thesis. So then the main research question that comes as a guiding research question and guiding my research is, how does then co-creation in design and development of sustainable systems support transition? The empirical background that I've looked is mainly socio-technical system of transportation. In the last 6 years, I've been heavily involved in questions of transportation, and I think that this is very relevant for this main graph. In the last 50 years, transportation volumes have increased considerably, and if the trends continue this way, we will have about, from, for example, 2.8 trillion kilometers driven in 100 years ago. Today we are at about above 332 trillion kilometers driven. And the forecast, or scientific forecast, predict that there will be about 103 trillion kilometers driven by 2050. So every moment we move requires energy, and every trip we make supported by transport technology consumes energy and other resources. So human physical movement is predominantly today done by private cars, and vehicle travel has actually risen steeply in the last 2 decades especially. So this is quite important to me. It doesn't let me sleep. It's a problem that I'm a bit obsessed with how to solve, because I believe that we are today sitting in a comfortable system globally. We believe that cars give us a lot of freedom, but fundamentally we're talking about a socio-ecologically ill-functioning system. This system cannot be really sustained if current trends continue this way. Transportation system, it interests me as well because it's critical and complex system. This is not something that a private entity can design and claim ownership. This is something that affects every individual being. Therefore, the way transportation systems are designed, I'm referring here to more coming futures, I feel that it's important that people and several stakeholders are involved in this process. This overall system of transport is actually quite prone to a drastic need for radical change. A substantial change in the system would mean that we move away from many things that we currently do as normatively socially accepted practices, and this includes a total reduction on carbon, on greenhouse gas emissions, requires a total reduction in energy use, requires a total reduction in material resource consumption, as well as the increased affordability and accessibility. I feel this is a paradoxical, absolutely difficult challenge we are presented to, and probably more research will be needed because so far I have been a bit skeptic over the promising alternatives claimed so to be. So although such change is quite big and needed, very few steps have been made, and therefore it becomes quite relevant to start exploring how we can develop alternatives, who is going to be present in those alternatives, what is the direction we should take in this relation. The methods of my research that I've worked with has been to engage with living laboratory experiments, or what we call as real-world setups for experimentation, and which promote the inclusion and participation of multiple stakeholders in the process. And in this case of my thesis, I've covered the 3 main cases that I've been involved on, and today I will illustrate mainly my main research work, because this is where I've spent much more time developing and exploring, but also 2 other cases that will be supporting, which I've been collaborating with other colleagues from other departments, both in here at KTH and also in the United Kingdom. So this is the KTH Mobility Pool Living Lab that I've been part of together with colleagues at KTH, where we have tried to basically from scratch to the end design a process and a system that would be involving several participants and people throughout the process. What this means as a methodology is that we mainly think of alternative futures as something as proto-designs, meaning that they don't have finished features, they are not completely ready to be in the market, and that they really need more investigation and development and exploration. And therefore, our job is not to really impose new alternatives, but rather explore together with people how these alternatives may turn out to be. And these projects usually have at the core the idea of societal practice changes, not just technological change, but also societal practice changes, because what transportation involves today is not just changing the technologies, it is actually heavily requiring the changes on people's behavior and the way we currently move. These projects are usually set out in everyday life context, as I mentioned, and in the case of KTH Mobility Pool, it has been in two large and small urban places, where we have worked together with both local and institutional and end-user participants in the process of the design. These projects also have a very experimental and generative character. What this means is that instead of just having a rigid way of approaching, we create openness and freedom to elaborate and explore context and conditions, as well as other parameters that we set out to do. So in the KTH Mobility Pool, this was enabled a lot by the way we allowed people to actually live with these so-called total designs or alternative solutions for their future. And by living with this kind of experimented phases of alternatives, people seem to start to be more engaged. And this is something that I would like to speak up in terms of what the findings of these theses have been. In addition, what these projects try to do is quite intentionally or deliberatively include diverse people. So especially in the KTH Mobility Pool, when I try to do the research, is to look for diversity of people in the participation during the process of design and development and implementation. So these are some of the field work things that I wanted to include, because I think it's interesting to show that this work is really founded on real practice. Some of the methods that I've used, and this has been quite challenging, I would say, for a young scholar like me, is mixed method research, which is supposed to support more interdisciplinary research, but is, I think, quite challenging to come to statistically scientific and robust conclusions, because when you mix a lot of methods, you get a lot of content and a lot of knowledge and learning, but it's also very difficult to come up with a direct scientific conclusion. And I think this is something that requires further development, and I'm really transparent about more developing the notion of mixed method research, because I think there are considerable flaws in the idea of mixed method research as well. But here in my research, I've combined several methods, which has helped because of the topic itself. Co-creation is really, really difficult to observe phenomenon. You cannot just directly observe it. You can look at different ways and different angles to get an understanding of how it actually works, but it's impossible to observe it very, very much in direct. So multiple methods were needed to observe this phenomenon. So what are some of the findings that I've gotten in this thesis? First is that one of the questions that I raised is, okay, how are people involved and in what ways do they contribute to the co-creation of sustainable systems? What we found out is that people are actually involved in different ways, depending on the form or method of involvement, and this actually defines who gets to co-create. What I found out is that three parameters seem to be quite critical when we are engaging people in co-creation processes, and this is how people are recruited to participate. This can start to include or exclude certain social groups. The duration, the intensity, and stages of involvement. So depending on the project and process and context, it will matter a lot on which type of people will contribute to this process. And the other is that how people behave or react towards the design. This is also another important factor which comes at later stages of the co-creation process. And this also defines in terms of whose voices are heard in the process. So what we identified was that actually it's not just users contributing, which is also discussed in some of the research present today. It is also non-users, or people who do not directly and right away engage with new sustainable systems. And this is quite important because what I propose in the thesis is that there is not just one way of involving people. Actually, co-creation is a spectrum where you have both more silent and non-active users, but also you have really engaged people who are acting as ambassadors in these processes. So here we define 4 patterns in the research with different characteristics in how they behave throughout the process. Then the second question follows, which is looking at motivations for co-creation. Because fundamentally, if you want to be engaged in something, then there is motivation behind it, right? So people need to be motivated if they want to participate. Sometimes you have people who are silent, but that doesn't mean they are not motivated to contribute in certain ways. Sometimes we have to create tools that would raise up the voices of those who are silent. So what I found out is that actually, contrary to what we think, especially in the role of designers and developers, is that people are not concerned, or people have as a separate entity exist in a separate, isolated world. But actually what I found out in the research is that just as we were concerned with the development of these solutions, so were also the people participating in these solutions. So what we found is that actually we are sharing quite common concerns over the future, especially when it comes to the uncertainties of making changes possible. It can be from the context of our own everyday life, it can be from the context of decision making inside an organization, or it can be from a national level where you have a power to really decide. So it feels that on the different levels of society we're having similar concerns. However, of course, this was really observed only in one case, so I cannot really say at this point that this is the real case for everybody, so I cannot really generalize at this point. But I feel more new research would be quite interesting here. The other is that we also asked, okay, then what are the factors that would support the process of co-creation and what outcomes would be expected? And this was quite interesting for us because co-creation is new in research. There is a lot of buzz around these concepts, but actually there is no systematic understanding of the real impacts of these processes. So we identified several enablers, but also several barriers. Co-creation as a method and also as a mindset is really interesting, but on a practical level it can be quite challenging, especially to align stakeholders and their ideas on a practical level. Yes, we are all motivated to contribute to sustainability, but when we get into the nitty-gritty of doing things in real life, it's much more difficult, especially if you have powerful stakeholders and civil society with maybe perception of having less power. But there are also really many advantages to this process and enablers, such as, for example, having access to diverse resources, competences, and support outside the boundaries of each stakeholder. Then also through my research I identified 5 key steering activities that I think can support different stakeholders if they want to engage in co-creation. And these activities have also been tested in the other case of the Living Lab, and not just in my main research case. And this means that there are potential ways for turning co-creation from a philosophical mindset into a practical application. So I think this is a further research that I am interested to pursue in the coming years. In terms of the outcomes, I think one of the interesting aspects is that it really generates multidimensional learning. And what I found interesting was that in 2 cases, actually provides strategic direction. What this means is that because many stakeholders have uncertainties about the future, when they are engaged in getting together, they perceive that they kind of know what they are doing. So therefore it creates a kind of trust between each other to pursue goals. So this is one of the interesting findings that I think I could pinpoint. Another aspect is that through this co-creative work, what we found out is that we can get a systemic understanding of the challenges and problems in relation to new sustainable systems, especially in relation to mobility, because it's such a complex system. When more stakeholders and diverse stakeholders are involved, we can see that each contributes with several very important key puzzles in the process. And I think this is also an effective way to develop further, because we are allowing for a more effective way of using the resources and in a way that speeds it up as well. Another, but not so, I would say, scientifically strong conclusion, and I believe that this really is something that I would like to open up for new research, is that what I noticed that instead of all these mechanisms that we are developing to promote societal changes in end users or people for whom we are designing these solutions, involving them in this process of change seems to be a bit more interesting, if not having a really radical impact. What we found is that people, when they get immersed into these processes, they get to start to think and reflect about changing their own everyday lives. So they become more agents and create more agency towards their own changes. And they don't feel imposed to change, but they feel actually part of the change processes. So what we found out through the research papers that we published is that in several ways, co-creation with the end users especially, it affects their perceptions, it empowers them to collaborate, it allows them to create sense of ownership, it encourages even further an interest in other sustainable systems, and also creates some cultivation, a culture of openness to changes. This is not all new. Research so far shows some of these results, but I think my research also reinforces further these findings. So to come back to the main research question of how I have concluded the thesis, is that what I found out is that involvement in co-creation actually stretches as a spectrum. It's not a one binary action. It's not that you just develop a project that involves some people and then close it. Actually, it's a process of continuous engagement and interaction. Therefore, whether people are using or not the alternatives, we know that on a grander societal level, we're actually all co-creating our material world, or the solutions by which we are going to live in the next decade. So then I think, I don't think, the research results show that new systems generally benefit both positively and negatively depending on how people get involved. So for example, if very few people today are involved in questions around sustainability or like new systems that are being developed by industry, then there is less likely chances that we are going to reach transitions desired. So what I propose is that through the research is to rethink the view of users' involvement and how we involve people in processes in a continuous manner. The second conclusion that I arrived to is that actually co-creation seems to build trust in new sustainable systems, but also it validates their logistical workability and their actual true impact. Because when people are engaged directly in the process, they get to experience directly the limits of these types of solutions that we are designing. And therefore it also stimulates further engagement, because people then get curious why things don't work. So I think this is an interesting way to move forward. What I propose then as a conclusion is that co-creation can allow us to expand our knowledge, but also improve the efficacy of design and development. Because I think instead of waiting linearly developing things, testing things, and then implementing, we are doing all of them at once. So we are proactively, actively contributing to the shared design. However, it's not all roses. There are quite critical challenges emerging from such practices, because it shows through my empirical research that it is still new in practice and proves challenging from a managerial point of view. Therefore, more research is needed in this area especially when it comes to practical carrying of such work. It is intensive work overall, and therefore requires that people actually do put efforts into this. And sometimes this was perceived differently from different stakeholders, especially organizational actors. So what we found as helping or supporting these processes was that creating a common design language actually supports. And in this, I mean both physical and non-physical tools. For example, in the case of KTH Mobility Pool, having this radical little vehicle allows stakeholders to come together around it and discuss issues. And it was not just the technology, but actually what it opened as an idea. Finally, a reflection that I raised in this thesis is that, and I start to ponder actually, is could that then these type of approaches actually increase the representation of wider cross-section of society in developing new sustainable systems, and could it actually widen the practical application of innovative systems? This is something that started to open up as I was concluding the thesis, and I think it becomes very promising because it is also relating now to the ethics of innovation, something that I think this research is starting to lead on. Because the more deeply I'm inquiring about co-creation, the more I see the issues that are currently prevalent in our society. So I think that co-creation, I reflect in my thesis that co-creation might be a way to legitimize change for many. What are the implications for transport? Well, very briefly, it is necessary to increase the accessibility of sustainable transport system. So basically what I propose is that based on this empirical work, we can see clearly that this might be an important and relevant tool for stakeholders to pursue further new sustainable alternatives. There are, of course, limitations to this research, and as I mentioned previously, these can, I'm quite transparent about the limitations of this research, which involve both methodological, qualitative inference, generalizability, and weak theory. There is really weak theory in research when it comes to co-creation, so for me it was very important to pinpoint multidisciplinary thoughts in the process, but I believe that further development, theoretical development, is quite necessary to guide practical research. Of course, the methodological limitations in this case are that despite the mixed method research, the inferences that I derive upon this research are qualitatively based, therefore statistical validation might be needed to generalize into other cases. Last, and I hope to conclude, is that I propose further future research that will be taken, because of course my work leaves with a lot of gaps and a lot of questions that have emerged now, and as I mentioned, I see a strong need for theoretical frameworks to support co-creative work and to describe this further. I must say that this is, although it might resemble co-creation work, is different from collaborative work. Fundamentally, it is much deeper philosophy than we have did so far in research. So there is quite some space for further development in this aspect. So I think I will finish with this. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Liridona, for a very nice and engaging presentation. So we are moving on to the next step in the procedure, which is the discussion between Professor Hisalo and Liridona. Welcome. Try the sound.
So Liridona, would you like to grab a seat?
Yes.
We are instructed that we have indefinite amount of time to discuss, and that's of course a joy, but you might faint if we start the 5th hour and you're standing.
I would like to raise the sound a bit from.
We're trying to increase your voice here.
whilst the sound is being worked out, you could potentially go into the name of your thesis in your presentation. I mean, you could keep your presentation up. I think it was really nice.
This?
Yeah.
I think we are just listening very low to you, so sorry for a second. Is it okay?
You can start, but we need to increase the voice.
Yeah. We can begin, I guess. We're hearing a bit low from your side, but let's go on.
Okay.
Let's see.
Yeah, I can't affect the mic settings of this one,
No.
unfortunately.
It's fine, go ahead.
Yeah, I think you can go ahead.
Okay, can people hear me?
Yes.
You
I
do.
can speak louder if you want that.
Shoot.
Shoot, okay. So firstly, thanks much for KTH for inviting me into this role. It's my pleasure to be here today. And in keeping with the topic of the thesis, it's also great that this examination could be done with reducing the unnecessary travel between Finland and Sweden so that we can use digital connectivity and reduce the amount of mileage that would have been cost in the I would have loved to be there in person. My teaching duties prevented me from the actual travel, but given the topic of the thesis, I think this is also very fitting that we see new future-oriented ways of not just incremental changes to the mileages expended in transport systems, but in seeking to reduce them with the arrangements. So thanks for being able to be part of the process. My next thanks go to Liridona. Thanks for writing the thesis. I really enjoyed reading, especially the articles 2, 3, and 4, where to be very, very interesting. And how I would like to structure our discussion, so you have some sort of pre-warning. I do have somewhat ways. We'll begin the discussion from the name, first the top heading and then the second heading, and we basically keep on going through your excellent slide set.
Vänta, nu hittar jag.
To deepen some of the points that you raise in a way that we also learn about what are the potential ways of doing things otherwise, and sort of maybe get a sharper sense of some of the discussion conclusion points that you've raised. So we start with the name, then we go to the positioning of the thesis in the research landscape. We then take a little bit of a dash into the methods, but not that much, and then we really focus on the your discussion points and the issues of generalizability. Okay?
Great.
Very good. Or do you have other ideas? Would you prefer to do this in some other way?
Well, I don't like linearity, but we can follow that.
Yeah, well, I'm sure this will end in fair amount of iterative loops, and even if we try to keep the linear in there, it's just easier on the audience to begin with.
Yes.
As I've heard it's a full house, and let's try to keep the full house or if not well entertained. So, the first question. Here we have the front title of the thesis, and as audience has now learned very much about what the excellent work with the Living Labs has been about and why it's important and so forth. Thanks for the great conceptualization in your opening statement. My first question is why the sharing of design authorship is, why you see that as the important aspect in co-creation of sustainable transport systems and practices. And sort of to clarify that a bit more, why the sharing of the authorship? Why not catalyzing the authorship or handing over the authorship to users?
Okay, can I answer now, right? Well, I will provide two answers. One that relates mainly to what I'm referring in the thesis as complex systems for society, where I believe that in relation, for example, to transportation or agriculture or built environment or energy systems, we're talking about a design which will come to influence not just few people in society, but everybody. And from what we have seen, especially in transportation, but I think also this is prevalent in other technological systems, is that their design has been a lot of times exclusive and privileging few subsets of society. And this has left us in a situation where we are today, for example, in transportation system, where quite a predominant number of people around the world do not have access to opportunities and resources because of exclusion to having that access. And this is by design almost a default. So when I say sharing the design authorship in the context of transportation, I mean that we cannot design things by involving the people most likely to be the first ones to adopt those. And predominantly industries have focused on the people who are first likely to buy things. And this is usually the economically privileged parts of society. And what I've seen in industrial practice as well, and of course my thesis stretches and focuses mainly in transport, but I started to think also in energy. For example, questions of energy inequities are being discussed. And with sharing the design authorship, I try to bring that level of awareness that we must think that by design we create authority, we create power, we enable agency, or we take it away. And therefore that must be already thought at the design stage. So
that's a good beginning answer, but my question actually goes, so you kind of cover the length of, okay, let's share the authorship. What I'm kind of curious about is that why sharing, why co-creating, why not handing over the authorship, why sharing, why not catalyzing to take ownership, why stop at the sharing?
Yeah, because also on a level of sharing, we can include also the competences, worldviews, insights, knowledge, and expertise. So expertise does not begin with professional expertise. Expertise is also when you are living your everyday life, and you as a human, or I as a human, have an expertise of how I live my everyday life. And you as a designer, or somebody else as a designer, has an expertise on how to design many things. But when we are sharing that expertise, we are both contributing to an enhancement of togetherness instead of one prevailing over the other. So with sharing, I mean that we should not just hand over the design to the end users, because that would mean that why that we should question why economic firms exist in the first place, why professionalism exists in the first place. So it goes to fundamental means of production and consumption. But I will not go there very deep. Instead, I will just try to say that both are important in the process for the sustainability systems, because we don't know how the future exactly might look like, therefore each can contribute to that likely future that we could design. I hope that answers the sharing part. There are more indicators as well. I could talk forever about this topic, but it stands fundamentally on the inclusion of society.
Don't worry, you get to talk about this much more, because this is probably the there are a couple of sort of lines of your argument which I think you are kind of your material and your research implies a more radical stance than what you argue for, and it's this aspect of sharing of design authorship rather than doing something else with the design authorship within the sharing. That will be very much a topic of discussion today. Can we move to the subtitle? Was that the next slide? I think that's very close by.
I did. I do not. I have it a bit later because
Yeah.
I needed to open the thesis.
Yeah. Here we go. Thank you. And the next question is, of course, about the bolded word here. So when you then position your thesis to the research literature in the coming pages, you see approaches to co-creation, as you point out in your opening statement as well. You point out that there is value co-creation in marketing, there's co-creation as sort of maker activities in design by centers and staffers and so forth. In value co-creation, you're pointing to Prahala and Ramaswamy as well as and other Bruce and other sort of more value co-creation, but value governance logic approaches. You are also putting into this co-design. You are moving to innovation studies where you cluster open innovation and user innovation as part of the co-creation. In the articles, you rely on social practice theory and you further rely on strategic niche management in 3 articles. In that context, you expand the co-creation network and public and private actors, which includes users, and you imply that we should be including non-users as well. So my second question comes into this sort of a bridge from how you frame your findings and how you position yourself in the literature and to the subtitle of your thesis. And the question is, what is not co-creation? If we take strategic niche management as co-creation, which you seem to imply, then the socio-technical experiments that give rise to niches and niche expansion, the latest, then necessarily these involve users as well as non-users. And they involve iterative loops and they involve learning by necessary. We will discuss learning at some point, but basically this is you are the sort of continuum of involvement here might already be quite small, whilst in the others the co-creation has very specific meanings. So what is not co-creation in design and innovation?
If I may be bold, the real world today is completely non-co-creative. But completely to say that would mean an exaggeration, because that would mean that we're talking about the theory of everything, and there is no such thing as the theory of everything. What I've tried to cover with co-creation and then see as not co-creation, by the way, it's a very interesting question, because I have pondered upon that in my second year of research. I couldn't find a right theoretical work, especially when it comes to sustainability-related science, that would describe what I was looking for. And that means that I should have proposed a theory, and that's why I need to put my step in 3 main areas, and I even excluded the third area, which is value co-creation, because that stands in much more philosophical undertonings of economic theories. And at some point it became quite a lot and quite expanded and so on. What is not co-creation? Not co-creation is the way today many products are consumed, used by few, but claimed as available for everybody. So that's one way. Another is that how sustainability is always claimed as participatory, inclusive, founded on the ideas of democratic human rights to this process, and it's not the case. So that is one
perhaps, or two examples. What is not co-creation is when we design things and we think that we are involving users by asking them a few interview questions or having surveys to ask them how they feel about a certain design. I think that is not co-creation. So these are maybe few examples, very broad, but that's the thing. It's a really deep fundamental philosophy, I would say. It's much deeper than I have been able to understand, cover, and this realization has come only late, very late as I was finishing the thesis. Because until that point when I really concluded my thesis, I couldn't understand that actually it's an implication. It's a real implication of just the word itself, because we're talking about co-creation that can be between organizations, between people, between products and services. It stretches in so many layers, and it's definitely, I think, a weakness for me as well, to where to focus. Where is the core of co-creation? I haven't found that yet. That's going to be new research.
Yes, indeed, there may not be one, but this is a theme that we'll keep on revolving around a fair amount in this discussion. But if we sort of simply, so these were very helpful answers from your part on what is not co-creation. Given that it seems to me, and correct me if I get this wrong, from your works and particularly from your articles, it seems that you are taking strategic niche management to be a co-creative approach, almost by definition. Then, especially when you're sort of discussing the benefits for numerous different actors involved in these living labs and how they help to shape the emerging niche. So, given that strategic niche management can be practiced so that the niche solutions are designed by designers without much more than questionnaires or even just feedback from the users. And then the users are involved only when the systems are deployed over there every day, and these are still sort of what James Stewart and I call proxy users. The limited few users who get to participate in the development activities. And the rest of the users are then mostly just taken in the capacity of just adopters of various types, even consumers, you may say. Would you then say that co-creation is an adequate way of, or including strategic niche management into co-creation is a sound thing to do, or should we see strategic niche management as an approach that gives sort of theoretical context for co-creation? So would you include it as an approach for co-creation, or is it foremost something that gives a context for co-creation?
Okay, I hope I understood that. I think now it became more clear to me where we're trying to go. Strategic niche management is a framework which can be seen as a sub-component of co-creation. So co-creation, if I would put it on a, sorry?
So you see it as a sub-component in co-creation?
Yeah, because it is, I use this theory mainly because I needed to study on an actor level. And here I was quite divided between actor network theory and strategic niche management. But strategic niche management, unlike actor network theory, proposes also power and politics involved in the around development of new sustainable systems. So therefore it became more appropriate. And strategic niche management has several developed parts, but does not really represent entirely co-creation work, because it focuses mainly on understanding actors and their interactions and dynamics. And so far there hasn't been, which I state in one of the papers, hasn't been much research on the activities around these aspects. Another thing is that co-creation does not necessarily limit itself to niches. So there can be also larger scale co-creative work. For example, strategic niche management only focuses on
small-scale, isolated spaces for research and development. But I think co-creation can be extended also outside those. So therefore, I see it as a sub-component that could help us to develop further frameworks, theoretical frameworks on co-creation.
Okay, so this is probably the first item that we might disagree with. I think if you start, given the reasons I stated, that because strategic niche management can be pursued in a manner in which co-creation may not actually happen in your previous definitions, so that the designers foremost or developers are building alternative niches and they rely on just feedback and max questionnaires from the users. Strategic niche management can be pursued without co-creative ways of engaging with users. So I would be very hesitant to include it as a sort of sub-area within co-creation.
Yes, in that sense I agree actually. Sorry, I agree, because on a practical level, S&M is very much not resembling this idea of what I think. But theoretically, if you look at the basics of this theoretical framework, then it sounds really good in theory. But on a practical level, definitely new research has shown when this theoretical framework has been applied that not necessarily it fits to all the prescriptive descriptions that it entails as a theory. So I agree on that level.
Yeah. So basically, and this is sort of, you didn't want linearity. So your kind of first comment that I think one of your major contributions is towards strategic niche management. Sort of pointing out that, okay, what would more creative way of pursuing strategic niche management look like, and what would be its benefits? But you don't spell this out as a specific contribution to strategic management, niche management, and how exactly it would fit there. You could then position it to, for instance, the Hogma, Trooper, Shot, and so forth, the volume from 2001 experimented with sustainable transport, where they go through quite an array of different sort of future mobility solutions that are not unlike the ones that you explore with the KTH mobility pool. But let's move from the title to the position of thesis in the literature further. So we started doing this already, and so we kind of agree that yes, the strategic niche management sort of stands in the border of what you would want to see as a co-creation. So can we go into the slides where you define co-creation approaches to so innovation studies, design studies?
This involves the two premises, or you're referring to something else?
I think you had a couple of bullets about it. But we can also go into the exact page. So basically, I want to first check that I understood right what I read. So in your section 3, you point out that you basically argue that design studies and innovation studies share an orientation in co-creation,
This one.
where users act as experts of their own lives. Yeah. You elaborate a continuum between two modes, one in which users are just informants to designers, and the other where they participate directly in co-creation. Okay? You further argue that all this literature by and large converges on this division that from Alan and others, that you have users as informants, but designers doing the decisions, and then users as partners or sharing the authorship, as you say. Would this sort of interpretation that there's these two modes, is my interpretation correct?
I tried to distinguish into three modes. And that's why I used the concept of presence, because it was very difficult to delineate the type of what I really intended to mean.
Yes, very good interpretation.
And so, of course, I have a remake of every single title in the discussion along the similar lines, but I think we can start to move towards the close of the discussion. We've discussed a bit over 2 hours, and that's, in my experience, pretty much the sort of limit how long people can discuss at this level meaningfully without needing a break. So I think we should start to move towards close. And so my final question, then I have a short observation on the top. My final question is about, so this was about sort of empirical sort of change, how we make the change more generic beyond these living labs, how we scale up from the living labs. Now I put back the academic hat, and then ask a question about generalizability, about co-creation. So we've established some boundaries over that maybe we should expand the continuum all the way to the user innovation research and to user-driven open innovation sort of works as well. That there's a longer continuum that's relevant here. And so within this range, and there's a huge range in all kinds of co-creation that you co-creation. So within this, if we look at the living labs that you're studying, they are very specific type of co-creation. They're very ambitious type of co-creation, very extensive type of co-creation. This is not something that you pick a random company, a random academic institution from the street, so to say, and ask, well, do co-creation. This is not the kind of co-creation they can embark on. This requires a lot of skill and a lot of resources. And so, so my question would be, would you want to reflect a bit on, okay, you outline strategies for co-creation, its enablers and hindrances and so forth. So how can we generalize this highly ambitious form of co-creation that we are now discussing into all co-creation?
Yes, I think it's also relevant to me. In the current research project we are doing, I have not been, as you said, it's something I actually did reflect a lot as I was writing my thesis about. Living lab is a kind of a fancy way of and cool way of doing research as well as a methodology, but it is currently very expensive. And one of my students just finalized her master thesis research, and where she tried similar co-creation following what we have done, but in a very, very cost-effective way. And we were puzzled at the results. She worked with a 3 months work in a neighborhood and managed to transform entirely the neighborhood, where everybody was really actively starting to completely reshape public space around their neighborhood. And that showed to me that, well, co-creation is not limited to living labs. Co-creation, that's why I didn't focus entirely my thesis, because initially it was the idea that I write about living labs, and with time I realized, no, I have to go a bit further, because co-creation can be exercised and set up also in other ways. There is not just the living lab bound in a way. And my students' research showed to me quite promising, and we also just published another paper on this current research that I'm doing now, where I work with municipalities and try to help them design these setups in a much more cost-effective way, where we call them living labs still, but they are very different from the context of what I've done in the thesis at this point.
But they are still very much sort of living lab type co-creation. If we think of the sort of traditional, the landscape of co-creation that you outline in your, in a sense, in your discussion implicitly and in your position explicitly, you include sort of casual ideation workshops, crowdsourcing, all kinds of quite superficial and shallow. If we look at how co-creation is being practiced, I dare to say 99% of the co-creation is in that relatively more superficial, not setting type of co-creation.
I would agree, and that's why in this case, going back to the sharing, me as design facilitator is so important to keep myself actively engaged in this scholarship, because working with municipalities, I've seen how it takes also another type of character to set up these. And I've tried, for example, for 1 year dialogues just to convince few municipalities in Sweden to get engaged into the idea that we can turn some of their urban space into a living lab experimentation zone where we can test electric vehicles and bicycle sharing and so on. Just to get into the idea that, hey, this is just a type test, a small scale, just try out something new and see how it works for your neighborhood, for your municipality. It's already quite different. But then you and I maybe have to go into the what do we mean, what do we understand with the idea of living lab. And in my context, that's where co-creation becomes most active, because living means that people are actually living with those solutions that we are designing, even if they are proto-designs. So that's where it becomes people are actively present in the design, therefore they are actually part of co-creation.
Very good. I think I think that's one of these areas where your conclusions and discussion could have been you don't do justice to the good work that you've done, in a sense that you could bravely point out that rather than inviting people to the town hall to co-create with the municipality, so the leaderboard of the municipality, for new solutions or do a hearing procedure on the next planning. What you would rather want to do is to set up a sort of lived lab experimentation setting, because it allows for different kind of participation and it makes room for different kinds of participants and capacitates them in different ways. And there's this new frontier in co-creation that resides between the sort of more traditional, as you mentioned in your opening talk, with this sort of traditional collaboration, sort of typically face-to-face synchronous collaboration, and then users doing it for themselves, by themselves, which is typically quite restricted to quite narrow sets of people. There is this area in between that you are sort of proving to be sustainable in all the three senses of sustainability, that it can be practiced, it's economically doable or viable, and that it can be used in further sustainability. And it's not a meager contribution. And as I've been noting throughout, so there is, to move to my kind of concluding point, after which I let the grading committee to ask their questions. I'd like to thank you. You responded. This was a pleasure to read, particularly the articles were thrilling. There's want to exchange further. There's a lot of points we can exchange further. The sort of discussion of the PhD work tries to do something which is very it departs from the observation that there is no integrated theory pertaining to co-creation, and then tries to construct the co-creation as an area and make sort of contributions to that area. The problem with this is that this makes the contributions somewhat sort of diluted. They don't point to the different bodies of research in the academic landscape on the area that the respondent delineates as co-creation. The problem isn't that there is there is no integrated theory, but there are many quite viable and very good theories. They are just haven't been integrated. And so in this factual academic condition, it would have potentially been wiser to make the contributions to each individual theory tradition and then point out how they fit particular gaps and make a clear contribution into those gaps in between. Because indeed there is this contribution, I think it's very valuable. So with this highlighting that this is very valuable work, the underlying researches and the research designs in these living labs is exemplary. I would like to end my questioning part and go as opponent here and hand the floor over to the grading. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sasa, and thank you, Liridona, for a very interesting and stimulating discussion.
And there's some paper to be left to write, right?
Yes, indeed.
Great. Yeah. So I'm leaving over here to the committee, and I think if you take the phone and then just share it with you.
Sure. Thank you. Was I supposed to look in some camera somewhere?
We only have one camera, so if you stand
Oh, yes.
beside Liridona, then we have both of you in the
Yeah,
same.
yeah, that's a good
camera.
I agree.
I can do that. Well, thank you for an interesting discussion. That was really interesting. And I also would like to give you a compliment. It's funny when you are an examiner or an opponent in these cases and you get a dissertation to read, you usually, maybe it's not for everybody, and certainly not for my thing, but it's like you start reading it quite quick. You want to get on because you have lots of work. Sophia is nodding, and this happened maybe at page 2 or 3, and then I noticed I started reading all the sentences and thinking about them, and sometimes reading them again. That's a real compliment because that doesn't happen that much. So it was really interesting, and I learned a lot from reading your work. So that was my compliment first. You don't know me so well.
And research.
Okay, that's good. So then you know that I have worked mostly in recent years with design for sustainable behavior, and not so much, let's say, from the innovation point of view, but more from a psychology perspective I've worked. And I thought, since you have, I think mostly talked within your comfort zone so far, maybe try to push you a little bit outside the comfort zone. Because one of the things that I have been interested in lately is the topic of shame. And shame comes in all kinds of forms. Shame, embarrassment, awkwardness, uncertainty. And I was wondering to what extent you have seen this as a topic in the research. I'm asking because, let's say, I think sustainability is kind of surrounded with lots of socially correct things to do, to think, to say. It's a bit, maybe even more so for the active collaborators and even the champions and the ambassadors than the, let's say, the vigilant users, as you call them. I'm going to put this down because I think I can improvise. And I'm wondering about, let's say, user-centered research methods that you use. You mostly use surveys, interviews, to some extent diaries, workshops, and I was wondering if there are symptoms of shame, like me being involved in this mobility experiment, and I want to I mean, you get confronted with yourself, right?
Mm.
You start to think, okay, maybe comfort or convenience or time saving is still more important sometimes. You don't want to feel like it.
Mm.
And we call this maybe it's kind of not silent knowledge, but awkward knowledge about yourself that you might not even want to confront yourself with. Did your methods allow users to share this? How do you? It's not a point of maybe critique, but it's a question for me.
Mm-hmm.
How do you design research methods that you as a researcher can give insight in this kind of awkwardness? And that's something that we start to experiment with, and I've done it with several students. Do you feel that those feelings can have been present among your subjects or participants in these case studies? And if yes, because I think the answer is yes, probably. Do you think that your methods can have uncovered these, and do you think that there might be room for playing with other methods, perhaps?
Mm-hmm.
You understand my question.
I think so. It comes with a lot of elements, but well, as far as my research extends, in the context of, for example, KTH modeling lab, we had reported insights by the participants because for example, people were living in these vehicles for 6 months. We didn't monitor them 24 hours, right? That would be a bit tricky, even though they were willing to, because we actually made it very transparent from the beginning that we are doing this together as research and you are just as us knowing about these things. We don't know the capacity of these vehicles or how much we can mitigate environmental problems. And initially there was, for example, after 3 months of work, and because we had installed also sensor technology in the vehicles, we could monitor the behavior. And this was a point where it was very interesting that what people were reporting in the interviews towards us and what was the actual situation in terms of the vehicles were not quite equal, which puts typically the type of interview methodology it puts it to challenge as usual.
Whatever was it, let's say, because you talk very briefly about prestige response bias and social desirability, and you kind of say, yeah, but we did mixed methods, and that means kind of covered it. So
yeah. So I'm going to tell them a story where when we did so basically what we did in the methodology was that we would follow these 16 households that were signed up to be actual living participants with these solutions. We would have interviews throughout the 6 month period. We would have several workshops at different stages to explore more on design. And then in parallel to that, we had sensors basically monitoring the usage. And when I looked at these individual data points, when people were in the workshop mode, it was very interesting because they were not at all fearing of what they were saying. They were actually sharing their actual experience, and it came to a point also the idea of how they felt in relation to their own private cars and how they could actually replace so many trips by these small gadgets, as they called them. You could notice that, but then if we would ask in interviews, there was more hesitation to share the personal feelings towards the idea of sustainability or sustainable behaviors. And then when we saw the monitored sensor technology data, which was like, of course, people like to say that they were very actively using these types. We didn't push people to say, now you remove your car and use these electric vehicles. We let that really be a choice thing. And even though, for example, with user diaries, we could monitor, we asked them for a week, can you just monitor what's happening with your choices?
And it was a wonderful academic discussion between you and Samsung, so thank you for that as well. First of all, I have a question about method. I was wondering if you could expand a bit on your own role as an active researcher? Because it must have been so many situations when you conducted your research, when you have, you were a bit into that when you in the first set of questions here. I was thinking when I read your method chapter, you mentioned things like bias and so on, but it seems to me like you link it more to the qualitative methods. And I was wondering, is it so that the bias is more related to those methods, or is it just more obvious when you, for instance, conduct workshops? And linked to that question, so the first one, do you think that it's most the problem with bias in qualitative methods, or is it, how do you think of it? Do you think of it as something that it can also happen with quantitative methods? And to follow that, I would like you to, can I ask you to explain a bit how you were trying to manage with the possibility of bias, and for instance this shame issues, and when you can have a maybe feeling and you discuss that a bit when you just see that things doesn't seem to go together, but also can be about your own interpretations. Maybe sometimes I can think when I'm doing interviews and interpreting interviews that I expect a specific answer, and then I tend to hear that answer, and then when I reread a transcription later I can see new things. So how did you manage with those methodological and interpretation challenges?
Yes, I mentioned in the thesis that there are some, first let's talk about the bias aspect and then how I have mitigated that. Initially, the bias that I tried to talk there, or at least talk about the social desirability potential, is that it can come both from me and the participants or the methodology. And this is something that I really discussed in a lot in a course that I actually took at KTH, where I was in a huge debate about there's something wrong in my results, because when I'm putting the same thing, for example, we measured one thing in interviews, which was how often are you using the light electric vehicle, and that was also monitored in kilometers driven by the sensors. And in the workshops we shared those kilometers driven, and people could reflect on that. So at each point I was at once, and this was not throughout all the data set, but this was the question that I noticed that something is not matching here. So then I pondered, okay, the users could claim that they are using it every day, but my data was showing like once, twice a week, for example, that they were taking the small vehicle. And that's when you start to question, like, am I saying something wrong, or is my data saying wrong, or is the actual reality of the participant that you are considering? So this is typical. In interview research, we know that there can be a social desirability bias, but I don't think there can be in sensor technologies, because these were really quite advanced, and they could really monitor every time the vehicle was started by that person. So you could see how much they drove, how much they didn't, when it was active, when it wasn't. So that was eliminated, and then that's where I brought it into the workshop with the person. I said, this is my data, and this is what we have, like, can we discuss about it? And then I learned a few good things, interesting things, I would say. Well, that's when people start saying, well, the vehicle broke. So that's when I went, aha, so it was neither nor, or I was just assuming things at that point. So that's why then mixed method becomes very powerful, because you can mitigate these potential threats to your own research questions or validity in this case. Mixed method research doesn't provide clear strategies how to mitigate, but it's also because each method cannot always observe the same thing. We know that. So in a way, triangulation can be done at certain levels with multiple methods, but I don't think it can be reached entirely and be completely consistent. So there's both the researcher's fault and the respondents, I would say. Yeah. Not fault, but of bias. It's mutual. So it's important to be transparent. That's my approach has been to really report data as I found it in both ways and try to show that this is what I have.
Thank you. And my second question, that's also linked to things that have been brought up actually, but maybe a little bit different angle to it. A key part of your aim is actually to come up with knowledge about how to have so small notes here, how co-creation can support transition. And there are quite many references to transition theory in your research papers, and MLP and strategic niche management and so on, and not as much in your cover essay. And that made me wonder also about after writing your papers and now when you were writing your cover essay, how are you thinking today about societal change? Because as I understand transition theory, it's very much about how to understand also more fundamental shifts, transitions in society. So I was curious about, first of all then, how you imagine now the link between co-creation at the micro level, which you have explored so thoroughly in your cases, and the wider or deeper transition at the regime level. So if we think about automobility as a stable regime, what's then the link between your findings about user involvement and the need to transform the automobility system very rapidly, actually? I mean, it's 8 years until 2030.
Yes.
So that's the first part of the question. And the second part would be, considering when you know what you know today and what you learned from your cases and your research, if you would have the chance to select cases again, or would you still go for exploring this type of? I think about the light electric vehicle case, for instance, which for me is, I mean, you discussed the concepts avoid, shift, improve, and maybe the light electric vehicles, it's about improving existing automobility, shifting in a way to small vehicles, but it's not about untraveling. And you have written thoroughly about the magnitude of change needed in the transport system. So could you, I mean,
Yes.
did you consider adding an extra case, or if you would like to do it again, case that maybe would challenge even more the automobility system, because it's still cars?
Thank you very much. I will try to see if I can keep to the questions without derailing, because very time. So transition theories was actually the starting point of my work, and when I made the first seminar, I had so much of that theory that I was advised to not be so into it. So then we decided to, since there was different frameworks of these theories into the papers,